1 month after being fired by the Toronto Raptors, Coach Dwane Casey has found a new home with the Detroit Pistons, reportedly agreeing to a 5-year contract as head coach. Casey said of the Pistons, quote, "They have a good team, they have a good roster, and a very dynamic owner." Casey led the Raptors to the best record in the Eastern Conference this season with 59 wins, but the team was swept by the Cleveland Cavaliers in the Eastern Conference semifinal series. So as we take a closer look at Casey's resume, he led the Raptors to 50-plus regular season wins in each of his final 3 seasons. To further discuss his hire, we bring in Rod Beard of the Detroit News. What was it, Rod, that made Coach Casey this franchise's primary target?
Well, I think it was the level of experience and the way that this roster is constructed. This isn't Phoenix, or this isn't a team that's going to be rebuilding for the next few years. This is a group that's almost ready to go when you look at Blake Griffin and Andre Drummond and Reggie Jackson as the centerpieces. They just need the right coach in place and a little bit of luck in terms of health for those guys to be a playoff-level team.
So with the obvious goal of every NBA franchise being to compete for an NBA championship, what, though, is the realistic definition of success for this franchise in the next season?
Well, next season, I think it's just getting back to the playoffs. And, again, not being the number 8 seed and being first-round fodder for a Boston or Philly or someone like that. I think they really want to try to get to the number 6 or 5 seed, or maybe even host a first-round series and have some momentum going into the next year. Where the Pistons have failed the past couple of years is Reggie Jackson's injuries have really crippled their ability to make a decent run in the middle of the year. 2 years ago, it was the beginning of the year, missing the first 20 games. This year, it was 37 games that he missed. They need their point guard, and they aren't the same team without Reggie Jackson, for what it's worth, statistically and just with the eye test.
And Coach Casey has said that one of his top priorities will be to empower Blake Griffin the same way that he did DeMar DeRozan. What, though, are the other immediate changes that you think need to be made?
Well, I think he's got to work with some of the young players and do some player development there. Stanley Johnson, Luke Kennard, Henry Ellenson, the last 3 first-round picks really haven't been impact players for the past 2 years. They need to get back to that, where those guys are really key contributors. We saw that a little bit this year with the Raptors and their bench. The Pistons need to have that type of bench that comes in and changes a game. But again, when Ish Smith is that engine for that second group, and he's got to be pushed into a starting role because Reggie Jackson is out, that takes a little bit of wind out of their sails to do some of the things that they really like to do. I think he's really just got to form some good bonds and some good relationships with the veterans on that roster, and the rest of those guys will follow along right after that.
Thank you, Rod. Thanks for taking the time.
Anytime. I appreciate it, Chris.
I do like, though, what Coach Casey said about wanting to help empower Blake Griffin. Similar to what he did with DeMar DeRozan, he changed his entire game. The Pistons superstars have included Andre Drummond, now include Blake Griffin. What has to happen with those guys for this team to see some postseason success?
Well, if you're Dwane Casey, the first thing that you need to develop is you need to develop an identity for this basketball team. And by signaling that he needs to help Blake Griffin, to me that tells me that he's going to make him a focal point potentially, as the focal point in terms of being the guy that they play off of. But you add in Andre Drummond. You know, how do you play him now? He's a low-post player that has not consistently developed a low-post game. Do you extend him out on the floor a little bit and increase his skill level? And what about Reggie Jackson? You know, you talk about the experience of Dwane Casey, Kristen, and he's had experience dealing with guards, getting them to play a little bit different way with DeRozan and Lowry. Does he go to Reggie Jackson and say, listen, I'd like for you to sacrifice a piece of your game in lieu of Blake Griffin, who we're going to really play off, and again, try to develop the identity of this basketball team, which last year they didn't really have.
And the hope is postseason success, because there has not been much. Since the 2011-12 season, they've made the playoffs just once. They've gone through 5 head coaches in that time, and they've made 3 lottery picks that are still on the roster. So as you look at their young talent and look at those guys still available, how important will their development be to their success?
I think it's very much a key, and also another reason why I feel Dwane Casey is the head coach of the Detroit Pistons. He has a history of developing young players. The bench in Toronto last year was one of the best in the NBA. And I feel players like Kennard, Stanley Johnson, Henry Ellison are an opportunity away from being productive players. They didn't get that opportunity last season except early in the season, but if they're made to develop over the course of the season, perhaps it adds a little bit more depth to this team. Again, can't stress enough, give them an identity that they have a second unit and some depth in the way they go.
And Coach Casey could be working on that young development of those players. A guy like Kentavious Caldwell-Pope never really developed in that system, and that's been one of the problems. Well, coming up next, the NBA draft is just next week, and the Sacramento Kings will have the second pick. So what will their